They were not asked. They were summoned. When war drums echoed across Europe, millions believed it was a European conflict, a clash of empires, ideologies, and generals with polished medals. But far from London, Paris, and Berlin, in the hot dust of African villages, in the rice fields of Asia, in the mountains of Nepal, and the crowded streets of Calcutta, another kind of mobilization began, not one driven by patriotism, but by orders. In 1939, as the Second World War ignited, the colonial powers did not fight alone. France called upon its empire. Britain called upon its colonies. Across Asia and Africa, recruitment centers were set up, not with flags and parades, but with contracts, forced conscriptions, and promises that would be forgotten by the men who spoke them. In India, more than 2.5 million soldiers were enlisted into the British Indian Army, the largest volunteer army in human history. Some volunteered out of poverty, some were deceived with promises of land or citizenship, and others were simply taken. Many had never even seen a map, yet they were told they were going to defend civilization. But what civilization were they defending? For them, the Union Jack was not a symbol of honor. It was a reminder of a system that had taken their land, their freedom, and now their sons. In French West Africa, men known as Tirailleurs Sénégalais, a term used not just for Senegalese, but for tens of thousands of conscripted Africans, were rounded up. French officers arrived with trucks and lists. Villages watched in silence as young men were loaded like cargo. Some left barefoot, carrying nothing but a rifle they had never used before. They were told they were now soldiers of France, a country many of them had never even seen on a map. In Indochina, under French control, men from Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia were pressed into service. They were sent to Europe, thousands of miles away, wearing uniforms too large, eating food they could not name, standing in trenches where the cold sliced through their bones. Many could not even understand the language of the officers shouting orders at them. Yet when France needed bodies to protect its homeland, these colonial soldiers were pushed to the front lines. The Nepali Gurkhas, fierce fighters from the mountains, were recruited by the British. They were praised publicly for their bravery. Better to die than be a coward. The British liked to quote from their motto, yet they were often paid less, given inferior equipment, and treated as expendable shock troops in the most dangerous assaults. Europe called it war, for millions of colonial soldiers. It felt like deportation under the banner of empire. They were loaded into ships, crowded, unsanitary, without proper medical care. The journey to Europe or North Africa was a journey into the unknown. Some died before even reaching the battlefield, struck by disease or hunger in transit. Those who survived found themselves in a war that spoke a language they did not understand, both literally and politically. When the bullets began to fly, colonial troops were often sent in first. French commanders deployed African troops to frontal assaults, sometimes without proper artillery support. British officers praised the fearlessness of Indian and African troops, a convenient way of justifying why they were sent into hopeless charges where casualties were expected to be catastrophic. In private, some European officers referred to them not as soldiers, but as units, not as men with names, but as resources. In diaries recovered from the front, one French soldier wrote about the moment he saw a group of West African troops being ordered into an exposed field under machine gun fire. He wrote, "They went forward without cover. They did not question the order. They were not told why. They simply obeyed." Many colonial soldiers had never seen snow until they saw it through the smoke of battle. Some, taken from tropical climates, collapsed in the European winter, their bodies not prepared for freezing nights in foxholes dug in foreign soil. Yet their endurance, their loyalty under conditions they never chose, remained largely unmentioned in official war reports. The propaganda posters in Europe showed white soldiers charging heroically, flags waving behind them. Nowhere in those posters were the thousands of Senegalese tirailleurs who held the line at Verdun, or the Indian soldiers who fought at El Alamein, or the Vietnamese labor corps who worked in dangerous ammunition plants in Marseille. Their victories were renamed. Their sacrifices were absorbed into the glory of imperial flags, and after the war, when medals were distributed and parades filled the streets, something chilling happened. Colonial soldiers were told to stand aside. They were moved to the background of photographs. They were paid less or not at all. Some were sent back to their colonies without recognition, carrying battle scars, but no proof of their service. In some cases, entire battalions were executed or imprisoned by the very countries they fought for, simply because they demanded equal rights or compensation. The world cheered the victory of freedom and civilization. But for these men, freedom was a word they had only heard from the mouths of those who ruled them. Greater than, they were called to fight for empires that would never fight for them. And as peace returned to Europe, silence returned to the colonies. The names of generals were carved into marble. The names of colonial soldiers were lost in the wind. They marched beneath flags that did not belong to them, yet bled more than those who commanded them. As war escalated, colonial troops were no longer just an auxiliary force. They became the backbone of imperial armies. Yet the world rarely acknowledged them. In official records, they were grouped under vague terms such as foreign battalions or supporting forces. Their individual names vanished under labels like manpower, reinforcement, or native units. In British command reports, Indian soldiers were constantly praised for their reliability. The phrase used repeatedly was disciplined and compliant. It sounded like a compliment. In reality, it reflected something darker. These men were favored because they did not have the political right to question orders. They could not protest. They could not refuse. They could be sent anywhere, in any condition. And the empire would not face political backlash, because colonial lives were not considered equal to imperial lives. In French West Africa, some resistance emerged when local leaders tried to protect their youth from forced recruitment. But colonial administrators responded with arrests, destruction of crops, and taxation pressure. In some villages, families were forced to hand over one son per household. They were told it was their duty to France. The idea of duty sounded noble in speeches delivered in Paris. But in the fields of Mali, Senegal, and Niger, it sounded like a demand backed by rifles. There are documented cases where recruitment drives involved tying young men with rope and dragging them into transport trucks. Some who resisted were beaten or shot. Their families were left with silence and a few coins as compensation. Historians found letters written by African mothers pleading for their sons to be returned, letters that were never replied to. War may be remembered in terms of strategy in battles, but for colonial families, it arrived in the form of an empty chair at the dinner mat. When these forced soldiers reached the front, they discovered another bitter truth. They were often given the most dangerous tasks. In the Italian campaign, British Indian troops were ordered to assault steep hill positions under enemy fire, while British units held the rear line. In the French army, African tirailleurs were sent into trenches first during German offensives to slow the enemy down. The logic was cold. Colonial troops could be sacrificed to preserve French manpower for future strategic reserve, military. Archives from the French command contain chilling phrases such as acceptable loss ratio. Considering native deployment, these were not unofficial words spoken in passing. They were written into official documents. In cold ink, approved, archived. Food rations reflected this hierarchy too. European troops received full meals with meat, bread, and coffee. Colonial troops were often given lower quality rations or substituted ingredients. In winter campaigns, when supplies ran low, colonial units were the first to have their portions cut. Frostbite and malnutrition spread faster among them. Yet when honors were distributed after a successful battle, the official statements read, "Our troops fought bravely, as if they were all treated equally," as if the battlefield had not been divided along racial and hierarchical lines. Medical treatment also revealed a stark injustice. In field hospitals, wounded European soldiers were prioritized. Colonial wounded had to wait even if their injuries were more severe. There are accounts from nurses who admitted that they were instructed to treat metropolitan soldiers first. Some colonial soldiers died not because their wounds were fatal, but because they were treated too late. And yet, despite these injustices, many colonial soldiers fought with extraordinary courage. Indian soldier Khuddad Khan, who fought in Belgium during the First World War, continued to fire his machine gun even after his entire crew was killed, slowing German advance. African tirailleurs, outnumbered and ill-equipped, held their ground in the Battle of the Somme with iron discipline. Gurkha units became legendary for their silent night assaults, striking fear into enemy trenches. But while their actions were used as legendary tales to inspire morale, their names were often removed from official citations or buried in footnotes. In certain war memorials built after the conflict, colonial troops were mentioned only briefly or categorized under other forces. Some graves did not even receive headstones. Instead, mass burial fields were marked with a single stone reading simply, "Here lie soldiers of the Empire." When parades rolled through the streets of London and Paris following victory, colonial battalions were present, but many were placed at the rear of the procession or positioned away from camera angles meant for global news. In some French towns, African soldiers were told not to enter local squares during celebrations. They were given separate quarters and instructed to remain out of sight once the ceremonies began. The Empire wanted their strength, but not their presence in triumph. There is a recorded instance in 1944 in a French camp where Senegalese tirailleurs were ordered to remove their uniforms and return them before being demobilized. The uniforms they had worn in the bloodiest battles were stripped away as if to erase their place in the war. Some were given civilian clothes in exchange. Others were left without proper garments. Without a uniform, they looked like they had never fought. It was a symbolic erasure. The Empire had taken their blood. Now it took their identity as well. The world hailed the Allied victory as a triumph of freedom. But in the shadows of that celebration stood men who had fought without ever tasting that freedom themselves. They had traveled across oceans, seen lands they never knew existed, and faced death in foreign languages. Yet when they returned home, they were not greeted as liberators. They were men who died for a flag that would never remember their names. The war ended with cheers. But for them, the silence that followed was louder than any gunfire. When the guns finally fell silent and the treaties were signed, Europe began its grand performance of victory. Flags were raised in capital cities. Bells rang from church towers. Politicians declared that freedom had triumphed and that justice had been restored. But for hundreds of thousands of colonial soldiers, victory felt like exile. The moment the war ended, the language of power shifted. While colonial troops had been needed, officers referred to them as brothers in arms. But once the threat was gone, the Empire no longer needed brothers. It wanted order, control, and silence. Governments that had praised their loyalty began quietly removing them from photographs, from records, and from public memory. In France, one of the most chilling examples of betrayal took place in Tirailleurs, Senegal, in 1944. Hundreds of African tirailleurs, recently returned from fighting to liberate France from Nazi occupation, demanded the pay and recognition they had been promised. They had fought in Europe, seen comrades buried in foreign soil, and expected justice in return. Instead, they were met with rifles. French military authorities labeled them as agitators. At dawn, soldiers opened fire on the very men who had helped free France. Official reports downplayed the event, claiming minor casualties. Witnesses, however, spoke of bodies scattered across the ground, of soldiers who had survived German artillery only to die at the hands of their supposed allies. The incident was buried in classified archives for decades. France celebrated liberation, but did not speak about Thiaroye. In India, returning soldiers expected respect after their service. Many believed their loyalty would prove that Indians deserved self-governance. Instead, they found that nothing had changed. Rationing continued. British officers still held power. The war had ended, but colonial rule remained. Frustration ignited into rebellion in 1946, when Indian sailors of the Royal Indian Navy mutinied in Bombay. These were not radicals. They were war veterans, men who had served the empire overseas. They took control of ships, raised the tricolor flag of Indian independence, and demanded dignity. British command reacted with shock. They labeled the veterans as traitors. Tanks were sent into the city. The mutiny was crushed. Officers restored control, but something fundamental had broken. The empire had expected loyalty, but obedience without respect had reached its limit. In French Indochina, something similar happened. Vietnamese labor troops, who had worked in French factories and ports during the war, returned home expecting reform. Instead, they were sent back to fields and taxed heavily once again. Ho Chi Minh, witnessing the hypocrisy, declared, "We fought fascism abroad, but fascism still lives in the colonies." The French ignored him. Months later, the First Indochina War began. Colonized soldiers had helped win a global war, only to be forced into another, this time against those they once fought for. The empire had used their strength to survive. Now it used bureaucracy, silence, and selective memory to erase them. In Britain, when war memorials were constructed, committees debated whether to include colonial names. Some argued that listing Indian, African, or Arab soldiers would complicate the design or make the plaques too crowded. So instead of engraving individual names, they wrote vague lines such as, "Here lie soldiers of the British Empire," a single phrase to represent hundreds of thousands of lives. In many cemeteries across Europe, colonial troops were buried in separate sections. Some graves had no name, only a number. Others were marked not by stone, but by wooden stakes that later rotted away. In certain regions, when land was needed for development, the graves of African and Asian soldiers were moved quietly or built over. No ceremony, no flags, no memory. Meanwhile, European soldiers received parades, pensions, land grants, and lifelong recognition. Their statues were carved in bronze, their slogans were taught in schools. Street names and monuments were raised in their honor. They became heroes of the nation. Colonial soldiers became shadows. Some veterans tried to tell their stories. They gathered documents, medals, and proof of their service. They took them to colonial offices, asking for compensation. Many were told their papers were incomplete, lost, or invalid. In some cases, records were deliberately destroyed to avoid financial responsibility. A few veterans burned their old uniforms themselves, not in anger, but in resignation. If history did not want them, perhaps it was better to let the past disappear. And yet, despite everything, they remembered. They remembered the cold nights in trenches where European soldiers shared fires with them. They remembered comrades of all races who died side by side. They remembered hope. But they also remembered the moment hope ended, not when the war began, but when it ended without them. In some villages, the only trace of their service was a photograph hidden inside a rusted chest, a faded uniform button, a letter written in a language no one could read. They had left as farmers, laborers, or fishermen. They returned as ghosts of a war officially won by others. History spoke of liberation, justice, and the triumph of human spirit. Yet liberation came selectively. Justice was conditional, and the human spirit was only celebrated when it wore the right uniform, under the right flag, with the right skin color. after the final parade, after the speeches ended, after the flags were folded, one truth remained. They had fought for nations that did not intend to remember them. A name forgotten is a life buried twice. When the world moved on, when new borders were drawn and new wars began, the memory of colonial soldiers faded from official speeches and textbooks. Politicians stopped mentioning them. Military parades stopped including them. Children in schools were taught about the great battles, the great generals, and the moment of victory, but not about the men from distant lands who fought in those same battles and never returned home. In many villages across Asia and Africa, there are no marble memorials, no engraved names, no eternal flames. There are only old mothers sitting in front of doorsteps, looking at the road with eyes that still wait. Some never even received confirmation of death. The empire had taken their sons. It did not bother to send back their names, yet memory does not only live in stone. It survives in whispers, in songs, in stories told around evening fires. In West Africa, old men still recount how their brothers were taken to fight for a flag with colors they had never seen before. In the mountains of Nepal, some families still keep the cookery knife of a grandfather who fought as a Gurkha, polishing it with quiet pride, even though no government ever honored him. In India, in forgotten alleys of Kolkata and Punjab, faded portraits hang on walls, young men in British uniforms, staring into the camera with a mix of duty and distance, as if they already knew history would not remember them. Time passed, and many veterans tried to bury their own memories. Some returned home and never spoke again about the war. They went back to their fields, to fishing, to working the land like they always had. But sometimes at night, they would wake up suddenly, sweat on their faces, hearing echoes of gunfire in languages they could not understand. They had seen the world, yet the world chose not to see them. A French African veteran once said before his death, "I fought to free a country that did not know my name." A Vietnamese labor corps survivor, who had been shipped to France to work in ammunition factories, returned home years later and lived in silence, carrying a foreign wound in a land that didn't want to hear his story. A Moroccan soldier, after serving on the Italian front, came back and found that his village did not believe he had even been in Europe, because there were no records, no proof, nothing. That was perhaps the final cruelty. Not death, not hardship, but erasure. Yet despite every attempt to write them out of history, something remains. In archives, yellowed photographs show faces that speak louder than any textbook. Sepia-toned images of African troops standing shoulder to shoulder in the mud of the Western Front. Grainy footage of Indian sepoys marching through European snow. Letters written in broken French or English, full of hope that someday someone would recognize their sacrifice. For years, these images gathered dust. But history has a way of resurfacing when silence grows too heavy. Slowly, historians began to unearth forgotten archives. Documentaries started to mention fragments of their existence. Memorial activists in Africa and Asia began painting murals, not of kings or presidents, but of ordinary soldiers in foreign uniforms, eyes forward, rifles steady. And when those paintings dried on cracked walls, something powerful happened. People stopped. They looked. They asked, who were they? It was a question that empires had avoided. But once asked, it could no longer be silenced. The truth emerged. The war was never just a European war. It was a global wound. The blood that soaked the soil of Europe did not flow from one nation. It came from many lands, spoken in many tongues. Today, some memorials are slowly being rewritten. Names once grouped under other forces are being researched individually. Families are being contacted. Graves are being restored. But for many, it is too late. The men are gone. Their parents are gone. Their stories nearly vanished. Yet there is still something that can be done. Because history is not just what happened. History is what we choose to remember. Empires may have erased their names from stone, but they cannot erase them from the voices of those who speak today. They fought without recognition. They died without a flag of their own. But in telling their story, clearly, truthfully, without the filter of empire, we bring them back into the world they helped shape. They were not just footnotes in someone else's war. They were the price of a world rebuilt. And now, as their names begin to rise from the silence, one question remains. Whispered like a challenge through time, will we let them be forgotten again? History tried to bury their names. But today, you heard them. If their story made you stop, even for a moment, then don't let it end here. Share this story. Speak their names. And if you want the next Untold chapter, you know what to do. This is Hidden History Files. Until the next secret is revealed.